My name is Lila, and for those of you who might be new here, I want to say welcome. It helps to know I'm not just talking to myself in this quiet room. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or just plain erased in your own life, then I think you'll understand my story. It begins with the end of a life and the beginning of a war I never wanted to fight. It started the day my cousin Paxton handed me a check, pointed to the door of my office, the office I had occupied for a decade, and told me my life's work was over. He called it a charming but useless hobby. What he didn't know was that this charming hobby was about to cost him everything. For 10 years I was the ghost of Blackwood Manor, the quiet cousin, the one who managed the sprawling, beautiful, decaying mess of my family's history. The estate wasn't just a house, it was a living organism of memories, a 300-acre library of wood, stone, and soil. My uncle, Jonathan, understood this. He was the patriarch, a man whose presence was as sturdy and weathered as the ancient oaks that lined the driveway. He saw the value in the past, not as a commodity, but as an anchor. He gave me the keys to the archives, a dusty collection of rooms in the East Wing that smelled of old paper, leather, and time itself. He let me build my world there. I spent a decade in those rooms, piecing together our lineage, restoring brittle letters, and digitizing photographs that were fading into sepia ghosts. I wasn't just an archivist. I was the family's memory keeper. When a distant relative needed proof of lineage for a heritage society, they called me. When a historian wanted to study the architectural plans of the original house, they were sent my way. I was the silent, steady engine that kept our legacy intact. It was my purpose. Then my uncle passed away. His death left a vacuum, a sudden, shocking silence in the heart of the estate, and into that vacuum stepped his son, Paxton. Paxton was nothing like his father. Where my uncle was oak, Paxton was veneer. He was a man who wore expensive suits that never seemed to fit his shoulders, who spoke in the slick, empty language of corporate synergy and leveraging assets. He saw Blackwood Manor not as a home or a history, but as a line item on a balance sheet. He saw acres, not ancestors. The funeral was barely over, the last of the sympathy casseroles still in the refrigerator, when he called a family meeting. It was just him and me in the grand library, a room where my uncle and I had spent hundreds of hours poring over old maps. The air was thick with the scent of lemon polish and my own rising dread. He didn't sit, he paced. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, and sighed, a performance of a man burdened by great responsibility. He told me he admired my dedication, my little project. Those were his words. My little project. He said it was charming, really, how I'd kept myself busy with all this old stuff. But the world moves forward. Lila, we have to be pragmatic. He slid a long, thin envelope across the polished mahogany table. It stopped just short of my hands. My severance, he called it. A generous gesture, he said. For my years of service. He told me the estate was being sold. A luxury resort developer. They were going to build a spa, a golf course, executive suites. He was positively glowing when he said it, like a man who'd just discovered a gold mine in his backyard. My office, he said, needed to be cleared out by the end of the week. They were bringing in their own people, of course, designers, architects, people who understood the future, not the past. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was looking at the portrait of our great-grandfather over the mantelpiece, as if seeking his approval. He would not have gotten it. My voice when I finally found it was a whisper. This is our home, Paxton. This is 150 years of our family. He finally met my eyes, and there was a flicker of something cold and dismissive in them. "It's a property, Lila, and it's my property now." My father was too sentimental. He let this place crumble. "I'm securing our family's future, not clinging to its past." He gestured to the envelope. "Take the check. Go find a new hobby." I sat there, frozen long after he'd swept out of the room. The check felt like a gravestone in my hands. 10 years of my life, of my devotion, reduced to a 4-figure number, and a condescending pat on the head. In his mind, I was just another piece of dusty furniture, to be cleared out with the rest of the antiques. But what Paxton never knew, what he had never bothered to learn in all his years of business school and corporate climbing, was that I was more than the quiet cousin. I was the one who read the fine print, and in the heart of the archives, in a climate-controlled sleeve, lay a single beautiful piece of restored parchment that I had personally saved from decay. It was the original deed to the Blackwood property, signed in 1922, and on that deed, written in the elegant, iron-willed script of my great-grandmother, Eleanor Vance Blackwood, was a reversion clause. She was a formidable woman, a suffragette, and a fierce protector of her community. She had insisted on it, a fail-safe to protect her legacy from men exactly like her great-grandson. The clause was simple, elegant, and brutal. It stated that if the land ever ceased to be used for family or community purposes, ownership would legally, automatically, and irrevocably revert, not to another family member, not to the state, but to the Blackwood Point Town Historical Society. I had been elected its president 2 weeks ago. Paxton had just sold 300 acres of prime, real or not-so-prime real estate that he no longer legally owned. The bulldozers were scheduled to arrive on Monday, and they were about to face a stop work order he never ever saw coming. It wasn't about revenge, it was about a promise made in 1922. A promise I was about to keep. The drive away from Blackwood Manor that afternoon was a blur of green and gray. I remember the crunch of the gravel under my tires as I passed through the wrought iron gates, for what felt like the last time. Each stone in that long, winding driveway felt like a vertebra in my own spine, and I was leaving them all behind. The weight of the severance check in my bag felt obscene, a cheap payment for a pound of flesh. My flesh, my decade, my life. When I got back to my small apartment in town, a place I'd always kept as a sort of anchor to the outside world, though I rarely spent more than a night or two a week there, the silence was deafening. It was a clean, sterile silence, nothing like the companionable quiet of the archives, which was always filled with the whispers of the past. Here, the silence was just an absence, an emptiness. I dropped my keys on the small table by the door, and the clatter was like a gunshot in the stillness. That's when it hit me, not the anger, not yet. That would come later. A cold, slow-burning fire. This was grief, a profound, hollowed-out sorrow that buckled my knees. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, my bag slumping beside me. The enormity of the loss washed over me. It wasn't just a job, it wasn't just a house, it was my identity. I was Lila, the keeper of Blackwood Manor. Who was I without it? My mind flashed back to my first day in the archives. I was 24, fresh out of a master's program in library science, with a specialization in archival studies. Most of my peers were fighting for unpaid internships at sterile university libraries. I had come home for the summer, unsure of my next step, and my Uncle Jonathan found me staring into the dusty, chaotic rooms of the East Wing. They were a disaster zone, a century of documents, photographs, and artifacts piled in precarious stacks, slowly being devoured by time and neglect. He had stood in the doorway, a tall, kind man with worry lines etched around his eyes. He said, "Your great-grandmother would have a fit if she saw this. She believed our story was worth telling. I believe it too. I just don't know where to begin." "I do," I had said, the words coming out before I even had a chance to think. A spark of purpose had ignited in me, so bright it surprised me. He saw it. He didn't question me, didn't ask for a resume or a proposal. He just nodded, a slow, trusting smile spreading across his face. "The space is yours, Lila. Whatever you need, just ask." That was the beginning of my decade. It was a slow, painstaking process. The first year was just triage, sorting and stabilizing. I learned to identify the acidic paper that was eating away at the documents around it. I learned about the delicate dance of humidity and temperature control. I learned the smell of mold and the silent, creeping death of silverfish. The work was solitary, meticulous, and deeply satisfying. It was a conversation with ghosts. I remembered the day I found the deed. It was tucked away in a tin box at the bottom of a heavy sea trunk, wrapped in what was left of a silk scarf. The parchment was brittle, the ink faded, and a water stain bloomed across one corner, obscuring a portion of the text. It was in terrible condition. I knew with a sinking feeling that if I didn't act, it would be illegible within another 20 years. It felt like a sacred text, the founding document of my entire world. That's what led me to Arthur Pym. Arthur was the town historian, a man who seemed as ancient and dusty as the records he kept in the basement of the town hall. He was gruff, territorial, and deeply suspicious of anyone who professed an interest in his domain, which he clearly believed extended to all historical matters within a 50-mile radius. When I first approached him, holding a high-resolution photograph of the damaged deed, he peered at me over his spectacles and grunted. "Blackwood business," he'd said, his voice a dry rustle. "You people have always been a mess. Think you can just let your heritage rot and then ask me to fix it?" I didn't rise to the bait. I just said, "I'm not asking you to fix it. I'm asking for your advice on how I can fix it. I think it's important." That seemed to disarm him. He spent the next hour lecturing me on the archival sins of my ancestors, the unforgivable use of acidic glues, the crime of storing photographs in direct sunlight. But beneath the crusty exterior, there was a passion that mirrored my own. He saw I wasn't some dilettante, some bored heiress looking for a project. I was serious. That was the beginning of our strange, unspoken friendship. Over the next few months, Arthur became my mentor. He taught me techniques for document restoration that weren't in my textbooks. He showed me how to gently humidify brittle paper until it relaxed, how to painstakingly clean away a century of grime with special erasers, how to mix a reversible conservation-grade adhesive to repair a tear. He was a master, and he begrudgingly shared his mastery with me. The work on the deed took almost a year. I built a makeshift conservation lab in a spare bathroom in the archives. I worked with dental tools and tiny brushes under a magnifying lamp, my world shrinking to a few square inches of faded ink on sheepskin. It was during this intense focused period that I finally uncovered the full text of the reversion clause. The water stain had obscured the key phrase, "shall revert to the stewardship of the Blackwood Point Town Historical Society." When I finally read those words, a shiver went down my spine. It was so specific, so intentional. My great-grandmother hadn't just been thinking about protecting the land, she was choosing its protectors. She was entrusting it not to the whims of her descendants, but to the collective memory of the community. At the time, it was just a fascinating piece of history, a testament to her foresight. I documented it, photographed it, and placed the restored deed in a state-of-the-art, museum-grade archival sleeve. I never imagined it would become a weapon. My friendship with Arthur grew. He started visiting the manor, ostensibly to check on my progress, but really, I think, because he was lonely and he recognized a kindred spirit. He would bring me folders of his own research, stories about the town that intersected with my family's history. This wasn't just a subplot in my life, it became a core part of my work. The Blackwood family hadn't existed in a vacuum. They were part of a community. It was Arthur who told me about my great-grandmother's community days. In the 1920s and 30s, she would open the estate grounds 4 times a year for town-wide picnics, concerts, and holiday celebrations. He showed me yellowed newspaper clippings with headlines like Blackwood Manor hosts May Day Fete, and grainy photos of children in sailor suits rolling down the great lawn. This was the community purpose she had written into the deed. It wasn't just an abstract idea, it was a living tradition that had been forgotten by everyone but Arthur, and now me. This information felt vital, like finding a key to a lock I didn't even know existed. He was also the one who pushed me to join the Historical Society. It's a dying institution, Lila. He'd grumbled one afternoon over tea. A bunch of well-meaning retirees who are more interested in bake sales than preservation. They need someone with real skills. They need you. I was hesitant, but he was persistent. I filled out the form, paid the small membership fee, and started attending the monthly meetings. Just as he'd said, it was a small, aging group, but they were passionate. They cared deeply about the town's history, but lacked the technical knowledge to do much about it. I started helping them. I showed them how to properly store their collection of photographs. I created a simple digital database for their records. I didn't do it for any grand purpose. I did it because it was work that needed doing, and I knew how to do it. So when Arthur announced his retirement as president a few months before my uncle's death, it seemed natural for the board to nominate me. I was elected unanimously 2 weeks before Paxton lowered the boom. At the time, it felt like a nice, small honor, a way to continue my work on a broader scale. I had no idea it was the equivalent of being handed a fully loaded weapon, just moments before walking into an ambush. Sitting there on the cold floor of my apartment, the grief began to recede, replaced by that cold, quiet fire. The sequence of events started to click into place, not as a series of random misfortunes, but as a pattern, a blueprint. The years of quiet work, the restoration of the deed, the research into the community days, the presidency of the society. It was as if I had been unconsciously building an ark for years, and Paxton had just provided the flood. He had called my work a useless hobby. He had called a century of our family's soul a property. He hadn't just fired me. He had desecrated a legacy he didn't even have the intelligence to understand. He thought he was closing a chapter, but he had just given me the reason to start a new one. I finally stood up, my legs stiff. I walked to the window and looked out at the lights of the town, my great-grandmother's community. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that, a mantra to keep the pure white-hot anger at bay. It was about justice. It was about honoring a promise. It was about showing a man who only saw dollar signs what true value really looked like. I picked up my phone. The screen glowed in the dim light. I had 2 calls to make. The first was to Arthur. The second was to Eleanor Vance Croft, a woman I'd met through the Historical Society. She was a semi-retired property lawyer, with a mind like a steel trap, and a deep, abiding hatred for arrogant developers who trampled on local history. She also happened to be my great-grandmother's namesake and grandniece. This was about to become a family affair, just not the one Paxton was expecting. The quiet cousin was done being quiet. The game was on. The first step in any quiet war is intelligence gathering. Before I made a single move, I needed to understand the terrain of my new reality. My first call was to Arthur, not as a desperate grieving niece, but as the president of the Blackwood Point Town Historical Society. The shift in my own mind was immediate and clarifying. I was no longer an employee who had been dismissed. I was the leader of a legal entity with a vested and very suddenly acute interest in the Blackwood estate. Arthur, I need everything you have on the community days, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the emotional turmoil of the last few hours. Newspaper articles, photographs, personal letters, town records, anything that establishes a historical precedent for the estate being used for public and community benefit. There was a moment of silence on the line, and then his dry, rustling voice came back, laced with a new kind of energy. I knew this day would come. Neela, old Jonathan was the last of the good ones. His son is a fool. I've been waiting for this call for 20 years. I'll have a file on your doorstep in an hour. His words were a balm, a confirmation that I wasn't alone in this. He hadn't just been my mentor. He had been a watchman waiting for the signal. He was the first soldier to answer the call. My second call was to Eleanor Vance Croft. Eleanor was in her late 60s, with sharp blue eyes and a hairstyle that hadn't changed since 1985. She was terrifyingly intelligent. She had built a career in Boston, fighting for historical preservation, taking on massive corporations, and winning. She had retired to Blackwood Point, the town her family had helped shape, but her mind hadn't retired at all. It was simply waiting for a worthy fight. I laid out the situation for her, calmly and chronologically: the death of my uncle, Paxton's inheritance, the sale to the developer, the severance check, and finally, the reversion clause in the deed I had restored. When I finished, there was a long pause. I could hear the faint clinking of ice in a glass. Then she let out a low whistle. Well, hell, Eleanor Vance Blackwood. That magnificent woman, she never did anything by halves, did she? She put a landmine in that deed, and the family forgot about it for 100 years. So it's real? I asked, my heart pounding. It's legally binding. Eleanor laughed, a sharp, barking sound. Binding? My dear girl, it's a legal work of art. Reversionary interests can be tricky, and some states have laws that limit their duration, the rule against perpetuities, and all that jazz. It's a detail that trips up a lot of amateur lawyers. But I recall a specific county ordinance passed here in the 40s, the Historical Covenant Preservation Act, pushed through by my own grandfather, I might add. It was designed to protect exactly these kinds of legacy clauses from being extinguished over time. It's a beautiful niche piece of local law that no slick city lawyer would ever think to look for. Paxton's legal team, and by extension the developers, would have done a standard title search, seen the clear chain of inheritance, and assumed they were golden. They wouldn't have dug this deep. They never do. This was the plausible inaccuracy I knew could exist. A local, almost forgotten ordinance that made all the difference. It was the kind of detail that made a legal case not just possible, but powerful. So what do we do? I asked. Eleanor's voice turned crisp. All business. First, you do nothing. You are now the president of an organization, not an individual. Any action you take must be on behalf of the society. We'll call an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I'll draft the agenda. Second, I need a high-resolution, certified copy of that deed, front and back, and I need Arthur's file. I'll start preparing the legal notice and the petition for a temporary restraining order against any site work. We'll file it the moment we have a board resolution. Third, and this is important, Leela, do not speak to Paxton. Do not answer his calls. Do not respond to his emails. Your silence will be far more unsettling to him than any argument. Let him operate in a vacuum of his own making. Her instructions were a lifeline. They gave me structure, a plan. They turned my swirling emotions into a clear, actionable list. The secret plan wasn't just about the deed anymore. It was about the meticulous, unassailable execution of its power. The next piece of my strategy involved a different kind of ally. My uncle Jonathan, for all his love of history, had been a practical man. He knew the estate needed constant upkeep. For the last 30 years, the man responsible for that upkeep was Thomas Green. Thomas wasn't just the groundskeeper, he was the estate's nervous system. He knew every creaking floorboard, every leaky pipe, every stone in the vast network of walls that crisscrossed the property. My uncle had treated him like family, and Thomas's loyalty was absolute. It was a loyalty that did not extend to Paxton. I found Thomas loading the last of his personal tools into his old pickup truck near the stables. Paxton had fired him too. No severance, no thank you. Just a curt notification that his services were no longer required. His face, normally weathered and cheerful, was a mask of grim fury. He saw me, and his expression softened slightly. Miss Leela, I'm so sorry. What that boy has done. It's a sin, Thomas, I said, keeping my voice low. I need a favor. I need eyes and ears. I need to know what's happening on that property. When the surveyors come, what they're marking. When the first machines arrive, can you do that for me? A slow smile spread across his face, the first I'd seen all day. He looked past me, towards the great house. I've got a cousin who lives on the Ridge Road. Perfect view of the main fields. Got a good pair of binoculars for bird watching. I think he's about to get very interested in a new species, the yellow-bellied trespasser. Consider it done. I had my legal mind, my historical expert, and my man on the ground. The pieces were moving into place. The emergency board meeting of the Historical Society was held the next morning in the cramped, dusty back room of the town library. The board consisted of myself, Eleanor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Gable, and a quiet accountant named Mr. Henderson. I presented the facts, just as I had to Eleanor. I laid the certified copy of the deed on the table. Arthur was there, and he presented his file, spreading out the old newspaper clippings like sacred texts. The room was silent as they absorbed the information. Mrs. Gable, a woman of gentle disposition, had tears in her eyes. To think, she whispered. A golf course, over Eleanor Vance's rose garden. Mr. Henderson, the accountant, was more pragmatic. He put on his reading glasses and scrutinized the deed. Then the county ordinance Eleanor had brought. His eyebrows shot up. This is extraordinary, he murmured. The financial implications for the society are staggering. We operate on a budget of a few $1,000s a year. This is a multi-million-dollar asset. Eleanor took control. She explained the legal path forward. A vote was needed to authorize her, as pro bono counsel, to file for a stop work order, and to formally notify Paxton Blackwood and the developer, a corporation called Apex Summit Resorts, that the ownership of the Blackwood Manor property had reverted to the society as of the moment the purchase and sale agreement was signed. The signing of that document was the legal trigger. the moment the land's purpose officially ceased to be for family use. The vote was unanimous. As I signed the authorization document as president, my hand was perfectly steady. It wasn't about the money. I said that to the board, and I said it to myself. This is about preservation. It's about honoring the intent of the woman who built this town. It was a theme I would return to again and again, a shield against any accusation that this was a personal vendetta. Of course it was personal, deeply, profoundly personal, but I understood that the moral high ground was a strategic asset, and I intended to occupy it. Over the next few days, I became a ghost again, but a different kind. I worked out of my apartment, coordinating with Eleanor and Arthur. We were building our case, not just for the stop work order, but for the inevitable legal battle to follow. Arthur's research was the bedrock. We found records of the estate providing firewood to poor families during the Depression. We found letters from my great-grandfather, offering the stables as a temporary infirmary during the 1918 flu pandemic. We found evidence of a continuous, unbroken chain of community engagement that only ended with my uncle's declining health in his final years. Paxton hadn't just ended a family tradition, he had severed a century-old social contract. Meanwhile, Thomas's bird watching provided a steady stream of intelligence. The surveyors had come and gone. They had placed stakes with bright pink ribbons all over the North Meadow, the very place where the May Day fetes had been held. They were planning to bulldoze the old stone walls that had stood for 200 years to make way for the first fairway. Every piece of information was a fresh stab of pain, but it hardened my resolve. Each pink ribbon was another nail in Paxton's coffin. Eleanor worked with quiet efficiency. She drafted the legal notices, her language precise and lethal. She compiled our evidence into a formidable package. The plan was to have the sheriff serve the stop work order on Monday morning, the moment the first piece of heavy machinery broke ground. On Sunday night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my quiet apartment, the legal documents spread out on my dining table. The deed, the photos, the newspaper clippings. They were my army. I thought about Paxton, probably sleeping soundly in the master bedroom of the manor, dreaming of his windfall. He was so confident, so dismissive. He had looked at me and seen nothing of value. A charming but useless hobby. The phrase echoed in my mind, not as an insult, but as a prophecy. My hobby was about to demonstrate its utility in the most spectacular way imaginable. I looked at the portrait I had of my great-grandmother, a copy I'd made from the archives, the same one that hung in the library. Her eyes seemed to challenge me, to ask if I had the strength to see this through. I am my great-grandmother's kin, I thought. I am a keeper of promises. It wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration, restoring a document, restoring a legacy, and restoring the proper order of things. Paxton had built his future on a foundation of ignorance and arrogance. I had built mine on a foundation of knowledge and history. His was a house of cards. Mine was made of stone, and the dawn was coming. Monday morning arrived with a pale, watery sunlight. I was up before dawn, the nervous energy in my veins feeling like a potent caffeine infusion. I didn't go near the estate. My role now was to be the unseen hand, the silent commander. My war room was my small apartment, the window offering a view, not of the battlefield, but of the quiet town square. It was a fitting vantage point. This was a battle for the town's soul, after all. My phone sat on the table. Silent. Eleanor's instructions had been clear. The papers were filed. The sheriff had his instructions. We had to wait for the other side to make their move. The law required that the stop work order be served only when work was actively beginning. It was a critical detail, designed to prevent frivolous claims. We had to let them break the ground. We had to let them strike the first blow. At 7:05 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Thomas. One word, "They're here." I closed my eyes and pictured it. The low rumble of diesel engines echoing in the morning air. The sight of two massive yellow bulldozers, their treads churning up the dew-soaked grass of the North Meadow, crawling toward the first of the old stone walls. A sight that would have broken my uncle's heart. It hardened mine to steel. I imagined Paxton standing on the porch of the manor, a cup of coffee in his hand, a smug smile on his face. He'd probably be there with the developer, a man named Henderson, a florid, hearty type I'd seen in pictures. They would be shaking hands, celebrating the dawn of their new profitable empire. The noise of the engines would be the sound of money to them. To me, it was the sound of desecration. For the next 30 minutes, the silence in my apartment was absolute. I paced from the window to the table, my hands clasped behind my back. This was the hardest part. The waiting, the knowing. I had to trust the plan. Trust Eleanor. Trust the chain of events I had set in motion. At 7:41 a.m., the phone rang. It was Eleanor. Her voice was calm, almost serene. "It's done," she said. "The order is served. The work has stopped." She gave me the details, which she was getting live from a paralegal she had sent to observe from a discreet distance. The first bulldozer had just lowered its blade, scraping a 10-foot gash of black earth in the green meadow. At that exact moment, two county sheriff's vehicles had pulled up the driveway, lights off, moving with a quiet authority. A deputy had walked directly to the foreman of the construction crew, ignoring Paxton and the developer completely, and handed him the papers. The foreman, a man paid to follow orders, read the first page. His face going pale, he shouted a command, and the roar of the engines sputtered and died. The sudden silence, Eleanor's paralegal reported, was stunning. Paxton, apparently, had been furious. He strode over to the deputy, demanding to know what was going on. "This is my property. You're trespassing." The deputy, a local man who had known my uncle for years, had simply looked at Paxton and said, "According to this court order, sir, that's a matter of legal dispute. All work is to cease immediately pending a hearing. Any violation of this order will result in the impounding of your equipment and the arrest of the operators." The developer, Henderson, was smarter than Paxton. He didn't bluster. He immediately got on his phone, his face a mask of controlled fury. He knew what a stop work order meant. It meant lawyers, delays, and money bleeding away by the hour. The best part, the detail that made me smile for the first time that day, was when Paxton, in his rage, apparently screamed at the foreman, "Did you know about this?" The foreman had just shrugged. "I just got here, mister. All I know is that paper has a judge's signature on it, and I'm not going to jail for your field." The first move had been a success. The silence of the machines was my first taste of victory. It was a quiet, cold, and deeply satisfying flavor. The panic on Paxton's end must have been immediate. The first sign I had of it directly was an email that landed in my inbox at 8:15 a.m. The subject line was just my name. "Lila." The message was terse. "Call me, now." I followed Eleanor's advice and archived it without replying. A few minutes later, my phone started ringing. Paxton's name flashed on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called again and again. The frantic, repeated calls were a testament to his unraveling control. He was a man who was used to people answering when he called. My silence was a language he didn't understand, and it was driving him mad. He left a series of voicemails, each one more agitated than the last. The first was confused and angry. "Lila, what is this? What have you done? Some kind of joke? Call me back immediately." The second was threatening. "I don't know what you think you're playing at, but my lawyers will bury you. You are interfering with a legally executed contract. This is going to cost you." The third was almost pleading. "Lila, please, just tell me what this is about. We can fix this. It's a misunderstanding. It has to be." It was fascinating, listening to his power dissolve in real time. He was cycling through the stages of grief, but for his ego, by midday, the real shockwave hit. "Eleanor called me. The Developers Council just reached out," she said, a note of grim satisfaction in her voice. "They've seen the filing. They've seen the copy of the deed and the county ordinance. They are displeased." Apparently, Apex Summit Resorts had their own high-priced legal team. And they were not fools. They had immediately recognized the validity and the seriousness of our claim. They weren't angry at me, or the Historical Society. They were furious with Paxton. He had signed a contract warranting that he held clear and undisputed title to the land, a standard clause in any major real estate transaction. By selling them land he didn't legally own, he had committed a material breach of contract. He may have even committed fraud. "They're not just pulling out of the deal, Lila," Eleanor explained. "They're preparing to sue him for their due diligence costs, for their lost opportunity costs, for breach of contract, and for fraudulent misrepresentation. They believe he knew about the clause and failed to disclose it." "He didn't know," I said quietly. "He was just too arrogant to look. The law and their lawyers may not care about that distinction," she replied. "His ignorance is not their problem. He's in a world of trouble." The silent takeover was working more perfectly than I could have ever imagined. I hadn't fired a shot, publicly. I hadn't made a single accusation. I had simply presented a fact. A truth written on a piece of parchment 100 years ago. And that single truth was dismantling Paxton's entire world. He had built his sandcastle on the shoreline of my family's history. And the tide was coming in. The tide was me. That afternoon I decided to take a walk. I went to the park overlooking the town, the one where Arthur and I sometimes met to discuss history. From a certain vantage point on the hill, you could just see the distant roofline of Blackwood Manor. It looked peaceful, nestled among the trees. The air was still. The roar of the machines was gone. I thought about the phrase I kept repeating to myself. It wasn't about revenge, and in that moment, it felt true. Revenge is a hot, messy, emotional act. This was cold, this was precise, this was the logical consequence of his own actions. He had dismissed the past, and the past had risen up to devour him. I hadn't pushed him off a cliff. I had simply pointed out that he was standing on the edge of one, and he had chosen to take a step forward. My phone buzzed again. It wasn't Paxton this time. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Sarah Jenkins, from the County Ledger. I've received a tip about a stop work order at the Blackwood estate. The court filing mentions a historical reversion clause. This seems like a major story. Would you, as president of the Historical Society, be available for a comment?" Eleanor and I had anticipated this. We had a statement ready. It was professional, calm, and focused entirely on the society's mission to uphold the historical and community-focused legacy of the estate as mandated by its original benefactor. It didn't mention Paxton by name. It didn't need to. I texted back, "I can be available in 1 hour." The public reveal was about to begin. The story was no longer a private matter between cousins. It was about to belong to the town, to the public record. Paxton's humiliation wouldn't just be legal and financial, it would be total, and it was a story I was finally ready to tell. The news story in the county ledger hit the local community like a lightning strike. It was the lead article on their website the next morning, complete with a picture of the stalled bulldozer sitting in the scarred meadow. The headline was stark: "Historic Clause, Halt's Resort Development at Blackwood Manor. Ownership in dispute." The article laid out the facts, quoting the Historical Society's official statement, which I had delivered via Eleanor. It explained the reversion clause in clear, simple terms. It mentioned my great-grandmother's vision for the land. It positioned the Historical Society not as an aggressor, but as a reluctant custodian, forced to act to protect a sacred trust. It was a masterpiece of public relations, crafted by Eleanor's sharp legal mind, and my deep knowledge of the history. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Paxton. The story painted him as at best a negligent heir, and at worst a greedy fool who had tried to sell something that wasn't his. The town, which had been divided on the resort project, now had a clear hero and villain. The narrative was simple and powerful. The quiet, dedicated archivist, granddaughter of the town's beloved historian, defending her family's true legacy against her slick corporate cousin. The first wave of the power shift was the client exodus, except in this case, the client was the developer. Apex Summit Resorts didn't just walk away. They sprinted. Their lawyers formally rescinded the purchase offer, and as Eleanor had predicted, filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Paxton personally. Not against the estate, which was now the society's asset, but against him. The suit was for the recovery of their substantial upfront costs, surveys, architectural plans, legal fees, and for damages related to fraudulent misrepresentation. The lawsuit became public record, and the ledger ran a second story. Paxton was no longer just dealing with a stop work order. He was facing financial ruin. His desperation escalated. The calls and emails, which I continued to ignore, turned into a frantic barrage. He was no longer threatening. He was pleading. He was offering to negotiate. He mentioned a substantial donation to the Historical Society, if we would just make this go away. He still didn't get it. He thought it was about money. He was trying to solve a spiritual problem with a financial solution. It was like trying to patch a hole in the hull of a ship with a dollar bill. The most pathetic attempt came a week after the story broke. He showed up, unannounced, at my apartment. I saw him from my window pacing on the sidewalk below, looking lost and diminished in his expensive, ill-fitting suit. I didn't answer the incessant buzzing of the intercom. Eventually, he left a crumpled note tucked into my door. It was a handwritten screed, a mixture of apology and accusation. He wrote that he was sorry, that he was under a lot of pressure, that he didn't understand. But he also wrote that I had betrayed the family, that I had humiliated him, that my uncle would be ashamed of me. That last part stung, but the sting was distant. I knew my uncle better than he ever did. My uncle would have been horrified by the bulldozers, not by the person who stopped them. The final desperate countermove was the one that truly revealed how little he understood me. He managed to get a message to me through a mutual family acquaintance. The offer was this: he would drop his claim to the estate entirely. He would publicly state it was all a misunderstanding. He would even make that substantial donation. In return, he wanted the society to give him a lifetime seat on the board and name the new Blackwood Manor Museum and Community Center after his father Jonathan. And he wanted to offer me a job as the director of the museum, with a six-figure salary. It was a stunningly tone-deaf proposal. He was trying to buy his way back into a legacy he had just tried to incinerate. He was offering me the very position of power that I, in effect, already held, but on his terms. He wanted to reframe his defeat as a benevolent act of philanthropy. He wanted to control the narrative. I had Eleanor respond on my behalf. Her letter was a model of polite, legal brutality. It thanked him for his offer, but stated that the board of the Historical Society had a fiduciary duty to manage the asset independently. It noted that the naming of the future museum would be a matter for the full board to decide in consultation with the community. Regarding the directorship, the letter coolly stated that the society would conduct a national search for the most qualified candidate at the appropriate time, but thanked me, Leela, for my invaluable volunteer service as president during the transition. It was a complete and total rejection, wrapped in the impenetrable jargon of corporate governance. It left him with nothing: no leverage, no control, no dignity. The power had shifted, not with a bang, but with the quiet, rustling sound of legally binding paper. He had tried to fight a war of aggression, and I had won through pure defense. I hadn't taken his power. I had simply stood my ground, and in doing so, allowed him to destroy his own. The most satisfying part of the entire affair was watching the community rally around the cause. Once the story was out, people started coming forward. An elderly woman brought in a box of letters her mother had exchanged with my great-grandmother. A local photographer had an album of photos from a 1950s town fair held on the manor grounds. The Historical Society, once a sleepy club for retirees, was suddenly the center of a vibrant community movement. Our membership tripled in a month. People sent in small donations. Local businesses offered services in kind to help with the eventual cleanup and restoration of the grounds. Paxton had tried to erase the past, and in doing so, he had made it more alive and more powerful than it had been in 50 years. He thought he was closing a door, but he had opened a floodgate. The quiet, useless hobby I had pursued in the dusty rooms of the manor was now the town's passion project, and I was at the heart of it. The power wasn't just mine, it was shared, and that made it unbreakable. The final act didn't take place in a courtroom or a lawyer's office. It happened where it all began, in the Grand Library of Blackwood Manor. After weeks of legal back and forth, with Paxton's position growing more untenable by the day, he finally capitulated. His lawyers, likely seeing the mountain of evidence against him and the ruinous cost of a losing battle against Apex Summit Resorts, had advised him to surrender. He agreed to sign a quitclaim deed, a legal instrument that relinquished all his interest in the property, transferring it cleanly and irrevocably to the Blackwood Point Town Historical Society. In return, the society agreed not to pursue its own legal action against him for any damages. It was a formal, unconditional surrender. Eleanor arranged the signing at the manor. She insisted it was the only appropriate venue. It was to be a transfer of stewardship, and it needed to happen on the land itself. I dreaded the confrontation, the face-to-face meeting with the man who had so casually tried to shatter my world. But I knew it was necessary. It was the closing of the circle. I arrived with Eleanor, Arthur, and the other two board members, Mrs. Gable and Mr. Henderson. We were the establishment now. We walked up the familiar stone steps, not as guests, but as the rightful custodians. Paxton was already there, standing alone in the middle of the library. He looked smaller than I remembered, swallowed by the cavernous room. His expensive suit was rumpled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He looked haunted. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a brittle, hollow shell. His lawyer stood beside a small table where the documents were laid out. He didn't look at me at first. He just stared at the portrait of our great-grandmother above the mantelpiece. "I don't understand you, Leela," he said, his voice raspy. "We could have been rich, all of us. This was our family's ticket to the future." "You're mistaken, Paxton," I replied, my voice calm and even. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times. But now that it was here, the anger had faded, leaving only a kind of profound pity. This was our family's anchor to the past, and you were trying to cut the rope. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes searching my face for what? Triumph? Malice? I offered him none of it. My expression was neutral, professional. This wasn't personal. Not anymore. "She would have hated this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at us. "All this drama, this public mess." Arthur, who had been silent until now, took a step forward. His old voice was surprisingly strong. "You're wrong, son. Eleanor Vance Blackwood lived her entire life as a public mess. She fought for suffrage, she fought for this town, she fought for this land. The only thing she would have hated is seeing her legacy sold off for a pudding green." Paxton flinched, as if struck. He had no answer for that. He walked to the table, picked up the pen, and with a shaking hand, signed the document that formally severed him from his birthright. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked out of the library, out of the house, and out of my life. We stood there in the silence, the smell of old books and victory in the air. Mr. Henderson, the accountant, cleared his throat. "Well," he said, with masterful understatement, "that's that." The news of Paxton's final fate trickled in through town gossip over the next few months. The lawsuit from Apex Summit Resorts had bled him dry. He was forced to sell his apartment in the city, his expensive car. He had to declare bankruptcy. I heard he moved out west somewhere, to start over. He was a ghost now, in a different way. Erased by his own greed, his removal happened off-screen, a consequence, not an execution. My new reality began to take shape. My vindication wasn't in Paxton's downfall, but in what we built from the ashes of his plans. I was no longer the quiet cousin. I was President Leela, the woman who saved the manor. My old office in the archives became my new headquarters. It was the same room, but everything was different. The light felt brighter. I was no longer an employee in the shadows. I was the steward, sitting in the new throne I had unwittingly carved for myself. We held our first community day that autumn, reviving my great-grandmother's tradition. We opened the grounds to the entire town. Hundreds of people came. There was music, food, and children rolling down the great lawn, just like in the old photographs. I stood on the porch watching the scene, and I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any victory. It was never about revenge. It was about this. It was about community. It was about ensuring that the story of this place, our place, would continue to be told. The land was breathing again. It was being used for its intended purpose. The promise had been kept. The reversion clause had reverted not just the land, but its soul. and in the process, I had reverted my own. I was no longer the quiet archivist. I was home. In the end, it comes down to a single, restored piece of paper. I keep a copy of it, framed, on the wall of my office. Not the original, that's safe in a climate-controlled vault, but a perfect replica. It's a reminder that the things people dismiss as unimportant, as charming but useless hobbies, can sometimes hold the most power. The past is not dead. It's not even past. It's a blueprint, a contract, a promise waiting to be kept. My story is about a historical estate and a legal clause, but I know it's about more than that. It's for anyone who has ever poured their heart and soul into something, only to have it dismissed and devalued by someone who has no capacity to understand it. It's for the quiet ones, the keepers of institutional knowledge, the people who are the true foundation of a family, a community, or a company, who are so often overlooked until they are gone. Your value is not determined by the title on your business card or the size of your severance check. It's determined by your knowledge, your passion, your integrity. It's the work you do when no one is watching. That is your true power. Sometimes the world forces you into a fight you never wanted. It can feel isolating, like you're the only one who sees the injustice, but your skills, your history, your quiet dedication, that is your army, that is your leverage. What Paxton and people like him never understand is that true wealth isn't just about money. It's about legacy. It's about purpose. It's about knowing you are the steward of something precious. He tried to sell a property, but I was protecting a home. He saw a balance sheet, but I saw a story. In the end, the story always wins. So many of you have shared your own stories in the comments, stories of being underestimated, of finding your own reversion clause in your life, that hidden piece of leverage that allowed you to reclaim your own narrative. Reading them reminds me that none of us are truly alone in these struggles. It's a powerful feeling, and I can't thank you enough for sharing that with me and with this community. If my story resonated with you, if it gave you a little bit of strength or a feeling of vindication, then I'd ask you to do me a small favor. Please like this video. It tells the algorithm that this is a story worth sharing. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you felt your own hobby turned out to be a superpower. I read every single one. Share this video with someone you think might need to hear it. And most importantly, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. By joining this community, you're helping to build a space where our stories, our value, are finally seen and heard. Thank you for listening.